Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast with your host, Jacob Ehrman. Today, I am joined by Kenneth Humphreys, author of the book Jesus Never Existed, published in 2005. He later published another edition of that book called Jesus Never Existed, An Introduction to the Ultimate Heresy, in 2014. He has also appeared on the film Caesar's Messiah, and he runs a website with the same name as his book, called Jesus Never Existed, which I will leave a link to that website in the description below, and I will also leave a link to Kenneth Humphreys' Amazon page, so that way people can check out Jesus Never Existed and the newer edition of Jesus Never Existed.
Should I add in there that they don't actually get or carry my major book? They only do the introductory book.
Right.
Amazon don't have access to my main book.
Yeah, I'll leave a link in the description too for people to get the main book. There's plenty of information on his website as well. And on Kenneth's website, Jesus Never Existed, he leaves a fascinating comparison of multiple different characters in the works of Josephus that parallel Jesus in different ways to show that Jesus is a composite character from his point of view. He thinks Jesus is a composite character. He's a fictional character with multiple layers of stories embedded in him, with parallels to characters like Jesus ben Ananus, that apocalyptic preacher. He was killed during the siege of Jerusalem on 70 CE, and he says things like, "Woe to Jerusalem," and it sounds like the apocalyptic preaching that Jesus does in Mark 13, but Jesus' character does. But before we get into those parallels, I'm going to start us off with my first question for Kenneth. So I first want to start off with, what led you to the conclusion that Jesus never existed? Basically, your journey in your life that led you to the conclusion that Jesus never existed.
Okay, fair comment. Most of my life, I believed there was some sort of Jesus. Okay, I have to say that up front because the subject never really interested me. I should say that unlike most writers in this field, whether they're for Jesus or against Jesus, I never was a Christian. So I've never been a Christian that suddenly, or in the course of time, lost my faith. I've never had the faith in the idea that he was a saviour. But I thought probably there's some sort of character because, well, it seems reasonable enough, a Jewish rebel. But how did I ever get into writing about Jesus? I was actually intending to write a story about the Dark Ages, to be honest, and of course that involves a debate or consideration, a great deal of with the Church. Holy Mother Church dominated the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, so. I thought, let's start with the church. Let's begin at the very beginning with the man who started the church, and then you begin to notice there's something odd there. You do not find substantial history of the man at all. You're entering a void. You're entering a void. If you don't believe the story, even in an elementary way, you find it rather puzzling that none of the things you might expect to be there are ever there. So I started to get more interested in the Jesus character, and that became the focus of my inquiries. And well, it's turned into a major chunk of my life because I've 20 years on this topic. As you begin to unwrap the Jesus story, you actually perceive that it's not an apple with a core; it's an onion that progressively unfolds to nothing much at all. In fact, there is no centre to the Jesus story other than the belief that God wants to impart his guidance and his wisdom and his intentions to the world, and he does that through the agency of something called his son, who is known as Jesus Christ, right? So there's this desire for this person to exist, but there's nothing to substantiate that he does. So then you have to look at, well, what masquerades as evidence And as you know from your various other interviews and your own studies, what you discover is elements of other stories are part of the Jesus story. That it's like it's a focus about which other elements accrete. So if there's a good story told about, I don't know, Apollonius of Tyana, right, it gets into the Jesus story at some point in time. If there's a good story told about Titus Caesar, it becomes part of the Jesus story. And you discover that rather than look for the real Jesus below this body of myth, you actually only find elements that colour the eventual story and are borrowed by that story as it gains momentum. Now, none of that would matter a jot to the world if it weren't for the fact that Christianity got lucky. It got lucky because it was endorsed by Constantine and it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that's when it really got into its stride. That's when it could invent its melodrama in its finer details. That's when it could get going. That's when it could drive out of existence its opposition and its enemies. And so that glorious tale got ever more elaborate, ever more exclusive, and it's what we're saddled with today. Unfortunately, people still believe the mythology. They still think there's something there. They still like to think, well, there was a really nice man behind it all. But sadly, there wasn't. Sadly, it's a story of humanity's struggle with reality and facing, the difficult choices that we all have.
So, what would you say, RV? Because I know in your book you go in through lots of evidence that Jesus never existed, and as you were discussing there, in your answer to the first question, you brought up that there's other stories being embellished onto the Jesus character over time, like Titus Caesar, as you were just saying. So on top of that, what would you say are like the top, perhaps 10 best proofs that Jesus never existed, in your opinion? The top 10.
Okay, top 10, the greatest hits, top 10 of the fraud of ages. Okay, I suppose that we'd have to start the story with the fact that, what is our evidence? What is the evidence even claimed for Jesus? And of course, we have to turn to the Gospels because that's the evidence presented to us. That's the story of Jesus. It doesn't exist anywhere else. There's no Roman historian writing about a secular history of Jesus as sort of as a minor character anywhere. There's nobody else at all. The Greeks don't write about him. The Romans don't write about him. The Jews don't write about him. But the Christians write about him eventually. They write about somebody. And then you say, well, who did? Who are these guys that write about Jesus? And then there's the first strange mystery that, well, we don't really know, although they are, according to Mark, according to Matthew, according to Luke, according to John, they are just assigned to those documents towards the end of the 2nd century. They're not signed by those characters. They don't say, I'm Mark and I knew Jesus and I'm writing this story. No, they are anonymous documents. And so we don't know who wrote them, which is rather suspicious over such a grand story. We don't know who wrote them. We don't know where they were written. I mean, it's implied that somewhere they were in, perhaps in Alexandria, perhaps in Judea itself, perhaps in Rome. But there's implications, but no evidence for that at all. So we don't know where they originated. We don't even know when they originated. Now, if you're a Christian, of course, you do your utmost to push the dates very early and say, well, they were all written within a year or two of the crucifixion. That's where you want them to be. So that's where you put them, right? Mm-hmm. So, and some people try and masquerade that's a bit of historical research, but the consensus of opinion is that it's much later than that, and we have a range of dates from round about the time of the Jewish War through to probably a century later. There's a range of dates about which it's as you would know, it's known as the sort of the Christian Dark Ages, when that very important period of time is just unknown to us. We don't know where things are, who's writing what, but it seems that then in the 2nd century, we begin to get some evidence of these tales, and they are all pushed back to a time before the war. So that it's implying that they are early documents and eyewitness documents, but they're not from eyewitnesses, and then they're not witness documents at all. They're a story. So there's point one. Point one, a compelling reason not to believe it unless we're totally gullible, and unless, as for most people, unless we begin by being a Christian before we even consider the evidence. If you're brought up a Christian, then you learn the silly stories in church, don't you? You learn them as a child. You learn to believe that, oh, this really did happen, and I believe in Jesus, I'm going to be saved. And then you might look, for some evidence. Even apologists do this. They confess that they already believed in Jesus before they even looked at the evidence. Let's talk about putting the cart before the horse. So, this is a clear case of wishful thinking. People who believe in Jesus really want to believe in Jesus. He gives some meaning to their life, doesn't he? One day they're going to die, they know that, but at least they're going to be with their loved ones in heaven.
Yeah.
Glory be. Isn't that a lovely gift? You actually, you don't have to study anything. You don't have to be particularly bright. You just believe. You believe, and therefore, we might all believe something silly, but that's what the Christians believe.
Yeah. So what's your so what would you say is point 2?
Sorry, you have to remind me of what point 2 was.
Okay.
The question?
So the original question is, what is the 10 best proofs in your opinion?
That's number one. That's
number one.
That's right. Number one. So you want to move on to the second best. Okay. So the second best thing is to say, all right, so we've got this anonymous story. We don't know where it comes from. We don't know when it was written. It's curious how it's constructed, right? It's by almost universal agreement nowadays. People accept that Mark is the first gospel, right? Because he inspires the others. They copy him, literally. Yeah. But the interesting thing is when Mark and Luke, and to some extent John, but when Matthew and Luke copy Mark, they don't acknowledge that. They don't say, this guy really recorded good stuff and I'm copying it and wrapping it up. They don't do that. They present their own piece of the action as if it's unique and clever and just for them. So the sources are very dubious because they can't even name a fellow evangelist as a source. They don't even name one of their own and saying, he helped me do it or something. It's presented quite fraudulently and without any legs. It floats free of any real tangible case. So there's that aspect. There's also the aspect that when you look at the stories, by golly, they all seem to have echoes elsewhere. Now, a lot of it, of course, is an echo of the Old Testament. The Old Testament speaks about what the Messiah, the coming Messiah, will do, and these echoes come into the Jesus story. Now, everybody knows that, and Christians spend a lot of time telling you, this is fulfillment. This is what fulfillment means. Now, to anybody who isn't totally naive, that is nothing other than copying. They found something in the Old Testament and they copied it into their Jesus story. That's how it operates. And it's not only from the Old Testament, it's from, anything that has some sort of currency in that social circles of the time. If there are good ideas told about Dionysus, it appears in Jesus. Dionysus, the god of war, of wine. And Jesus, well, what does he do? Like Dionysus, he turns water into wine. Now, one can understand why Dionysus would do that. He was the god of the harvest. But why would Jesus do that? Why would Jesus, like at the wedding, want to turn water into wine and have this huge celebration, drunken orgy by the sound of things, gallons and gallons of wine? It has no moral value. It's okay. It shows how clever he is, but a big deal. But you see, it's an oddity that's stuck into the Jesus story because it knocks out the competition. If the priests of Dionysus say our God does that, the Christians will say, well, so does our God, and he does it better, right? And you can go on through, all of them. We all know the story of calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee, And I always like to point out to people that no one called the Sea of Galilee until Mark did. And then Mark, until then, it was called a lake. It was known as Lake Tiberias, as far as the Romans were concerned. It was like Lake Tarachier, I think, to the Greeks. It was a lake because it's not very big. It's 6 miles by, 4 miles or something. It's a lake. And yet it has to be turned into a storm because then this new wondrous God can do something magical, calm the storm. But that's something that Poseidon did. So Poseidon was the god of storms and could control the weather. But Jesus comes along, knock out that particular god as well. And so we can go on to Asclepius, the god of healing, and Jesus does all the healing. And it gets very painfully familiar because it's like one size fits all. You don't need all these other gods because you have Jesus. Our Jesus has everything. And so the point is, it's not even an original story. It's a copied story. So how can we believe it's true? It has no foundations in reality. It just is a fabrication.
And there's a story in the Greek myths that Orion, he's the son of Poseidon, although not even in the usual way, not even in a usual mythological sense, because Orion was born by when Poseidon, Hermes, and Zeus urinated in some lake, and Orion rose out of their urine. And at one point, I think he was even called Urian because of that. And because Orion was a son of, one of those guys, Poseidon, he was given the power to walk on water. And I thought to myself, well, that does sound like Jesus walking on water. And Orion's walking on water because one of his fathers is a sea god. So he's given the power to walk, he's given power over water. And it kind of reminded me of Jesus. I'm like, yeah, Jesus is doing the same thing Orion did. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you can see how in that era of Roman domination, all the local gods, all the local cults and enthusiasms were in fierce conflict. It was a time of turmoil. Roman gods were everywhere, but the Romans were accepting of local gods because they just assimilated them to their own god and gave them a similar name. So, but obviously these cults were competing with each other because it was adapt or die. So if a rival cult had something that was successful, then you copied it into your cult. And people did quite happily move between these various enthusiasms. In fact, they could have several of them. When you're in a town square like Corinth, around the Roman center of Corinth, you can see the various temples to the various gods. And so you could drop a few incense and a few coins or some wine in each of them because you want to keep them all on your side. That's how you protected yourself from the uncertainties of the future. You got the gods on your side. And so what you see in developing Christianity is a certain not only wholesale borrowing, which probably would have stuff borrowed the other way if they had half the chance. But the wholesale borrowing of earlier cults, and but also the creeping element of intolerance coming into it, because whereas polytheists tolerated quite happily other gods, the Christians, of course, had an intolerant attitude, that they didn't want other gods. They associated other gods, as elements of the devil, so they demonized the alternate gods and were intolerant of them. So, it wasn't a happy development for humanity. That this is how it took place. The Christians, of course, were initially intolerant of each other. They broke their myth into various parts, and some of them adopted one form and some another. So there was a fierce rival between them all.
Kind of like with the Marcionites in the early 2nd century.
Absolutely. And you start with the Marcionites, but you can have a whole list of these various factions and division, and of course. Then we come back again to the Roman state, and of course, Constantine wasn't into all this, dance. How many fairies dance on a pin? He wanted something practical, and he basically, used the power of the state to hammer out what was allowed, and then you had heresy. Heresy, and as you probably know, it means choice. Well, no, we're not having any choice. You have this religion. This is what we believe. And then, of course, you had to have creeds that codified. This is your thoughts. Don't have any thoughts of your own. These are your thoughts. And this is Christianity's gift to the world, isn't it? The gift to the world. You have to learn this by rote. You chant it out all the time. Your thinking about it all collapses into a narrow, intolerant focus. That's Christianity's gift to the world.
So what would you say is point 3 of the 10 points?
Point 3.
Mm-hmm.
Point 3. Well, okay. Point 3. A good illustration of the bogus nature of Christianity is not to look initially at those first muddy and confusing early centuries. Move the clock forward a bit and get into the Dark Age, right? Get into the Dark Age. And the one thing we know about the Dark Age is that the church was dominant and evidence for Jesus was everywhere. That is the stark truth. You didn't have doubts in those centuries because the church could produce evidence all the time. If you wanted to see the straw on which Jesus lay in the manger, the church could provide the very straw. They had vials of his blood. They had his baby teeth. They had everything from you name it, they had it. The cloak that Mary wore when she was giving birth. It was limitless, because the most obvious thing was the catacombs, which we often hear about, Christians hiding in catacombs, but the catacombs are much older, and the catacombs were full of bones. Well, that was very useful during the Dark Ages, very useful to produce bones, which you could maintain was the bones of saints. Yeah, and who could doubt it? Who could doubt a priest getting up in his pulpit and waving a bone about and talking about some saint who had died for Christ, and and it had people used them as medicines. They crowned them up to use as medicines. They did that with some early texts. It was so valuable that they could turn it into something to beat off the demons. So we went through a period that lasted, best part of 1,000 years of totally fraudulent evidence for Christianity. Now, I just put to you the proposition. If this was true, why would the church need to be so inventive? Why would you spend centuries inventing rubbish to fool the masses if you had the true story?
That's a good point.
it's self-evident, and they went online until eventually, even into recent times, people still invent stuff for Jesus. We're in late November now. If things run according to a schedule, any day now we'll hear of an announcement coming from Israel that somewhere in the Holy Land they've discovered something that helps prove Jesus, the first evidence of Jesus, because it fits in with the Christmas season, and we like a little bit of propaganda to go on to make people, go down to the churches and put a few dollars in the box. And here is the fraud still continuing. But you only have to put the clock back and say, well, why have we stopped waving the bones around? Because everybody now knows it's just fraudulent. It's just fraudulent. Every Catholic church in Europe at some stage had to have a relic. In the altar, they had to have a relic. It was that widespread, to give themselves some sort of sanctity and holiness, complete invention. Why would a true story need complete invention? Because it was invented from the very beginning. That's why.
So what would point 4 be?
we should have a little jingle to go with this, and number 4. Okay. So we've got the borrowing, we've got the fraud. Okay, let's take an obvious thing then. How is it some basic things like Nazareth and, even Jesus himself, are just, almost unknown. Let's just take Nazareth, Nazareth, surely, it's described quite unambiguously in the New Testament as a city, isn't it? The city of Nazareth. And yet, there's no such city ever been found. In fact, it's so absent from the real city of Nazareth that's there today that they have, in fact, created a Disneyland type fake Nazareth. You can go and watch donkeys being pulled around by shepherds, and the rest of it, and people living in little huts, and it's sort of it's that sort of that history, that sort of fake little world in which we've learned it's such a trope of our culture that we know the story, the wise men with the animals in the stable, the traipsing, the pregnant woman traipsing about, and it makes all the cards look nice, doesn't it? They have helped build that world, because the real Nazareth wasn't there. They can't take you to a site of ancient Nazareth. What had they found there? Okay, there was some sort of farm there. Some sort of farm, a family, perhaps, maybe an extended family of a dozen people. But, it maintains it was a city where there was a synagogue, where Jesus actually went and read some stuff. It just doesn't fit with that at all. It's just more fakery. This very, even when the first pilgrim of Bordeaux went to the Holy Land, it didn't stop at Nazareth. He was actually visiting sites that the Jews had said were parts of the Old Testament tale. These were things where Moses did this and Jacob did that. But the story, of Jesus, he doesn't find it. Okay, there's Jerusalem. Yes, okay, we have the final act in Jerusalem, but the rest of it couldn't be found. So that takes me on to point 5, is it? Point 5 is, where are these places or the Jesus venue? Where are these places? I've looked at them. If you've looked at my website, you might be familiar with that.
Yeah.
That all these places, where he's done miracles, he's done healings, they are all suspiciously vague. And yet we're not so ignorant of what towns and villages were present in the Holy Land at that stage, because Josephus, a very important historian, he provides evidence of, I think it's 18 villages he speaks of in Nazareth, in Galilee. and Nazareth isn't one of them. So the person who is there, who actually gives us a historical record of towns and places in that area, his evidence doesn't get validated by the gospel, but the gospels have other sites which just nobody finds, or they find several possibilities for those stories. And that again, so you think the venue doesn't fit. They've invented. It's like it's one thing to put a story in, say, New York. We know in New York is you put it, but to actually then have to go to the story with the case of Jesus, where he has to have even a town that doesn't exist for his hometown. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. So the venues are very, very, very questionable. And when you do look at those, you find that many of them have precedence in Jewish fables. The place where did Jesus get baptized, for example? Where did he get baptized? Well, it turns out, it was somewhere that happens to have been a place where the Jews did something grand, like they crossed the River Jordan and entered the Promised Land. So it's sort of like one miracle, it sits on top of another miracle because that area has already been sanctified. Yeah. So the story is just a counterfeit story in a made up land, is what I've often concluded again and again and again.
So what would you say is point 6 at this point?
You're going to hold me to 10, aren't you? You're going to hold me to 10. Okay. What else will we say? Well, okay. We've said about where his locations. What does Jesus say that is so profound? It always puzzles me. I think there was a time when George Bush said his favourite philosopher was Jesus. I remember watching a debate when he was running for, the candidate of the Republican Party, and he was asked who was his favourite philosopher, and he obviously floored the audience by saying Jesus, and I thought Jesus, because is there anything in Jesus that qualifies him to be a philosopher? I mean, you get lots of mileage out of that aphorisms about love your neighbour, love your neighbour, love your enemies. I mean, they're the most preposterous sort of little guidance rules, aren't they? Why would you do that? Has anybody ever done that? Has anyone, okay, if you put it a bit more sophisticated, like the Greeks did, such as be kind to your enemies, be a bit magnanimous in victory, well, that we can understand. But Jesus boils it down. Love your enemies, love your neighbours, put them all before you and the rest of it. Totally impractical. And you see, what masquerades as Jesus's philosophy is really just secondhand stuff from other people, much of it Greek philosophers. So he's not even got an original message, right? This man who's so wonderful, it's not even got an original message, and no wonder he doesn't write a word of it down either. It's like, well, we keep saying how wonderful this guy is, but just take that thing about love one another. Is anyone's definition of love the same as everyone else's? I mean, it sounds nice enough, love one another, but it's not a practical thing, is it? You like people, you're kind to people, you be generous to people, but you don't love everybody. And name me one Christian community where they all loved each other. Because when I've looked at, say, the first Christian communities in New England, they weren't loving each other. They were hanging people who didn't believe the same way they did. That's how much how ridiculous is the so-called philosophy of Jesus. So it's not. So there's no original message there. There's no original message. There's no original story. There's no reality to the landscape. How much more evidence do we need that the story is concocted?
As for point 7, would you say I feel let's bring Paul into this one.
Right. Yeah,
Paul,
Paul.
I always found it strange how Paul's Jesus is so lacking in comparison to the gospel Jesus. The whole colorful story, the biography just isn't there. Paul's telling his opponents about, oh, I'm having these revelations from Jesus, and doesn't really get into his life. Well, and in his letters to the Corinthians, he says, okay, he quotes Jesus like 3 times, and they're strange quotes, and they almost sound like the back guy. He says, he quotes Jesus allegedly having said, "Eat my flesh, it's bread. Drink my blood, it's wine." And it sounds like the scene in Greek mythology when the Titans tear up Dionysus, the god of wine, and they do just that. They drink his blood and they eat his flesh. And I wanted to ask you, in regards to point 7, would you say that Paul's lacking on a biography, on a serious biography of Jesus like the Gospels do? The Gospels are written later after Paul, building over that and adding this extensive biography. Would you say that's evidence in itself that Jesus didn't exist?
I'd certainly say it contributes to that, but
Mm-hmm.
let's put it a slightly different way. We could say that the story is clobbered together in a very imprecise way.
Mm.
First point about that is we don't have a gospel, we have 4 gospels.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why would we have 4 gospels that differ with each other so many times it's not true, right? They don't consistently agree on anything and often flatly contradict each other. That is the first strangeness,
Mm-hmm.
which we can explain perfectly well from a secular point of view, but that is the first. The second one is the transformation of what would seem we start off with a story. God comes to earth, or the Son of God comes to earth, right? And he chooses 12 apostles to spread the word. He gives them the power over spirits and so on. Okay, but then we switch the story halfway through and we talk about Paul, not one of the 12 that he's chosen. The story is now totally different. It's not the 12 going out spreading. That's not what we read about in the Acts of the Apostle. We don't hear about most of them at all. But what we hear about a lot is Paul. So now we've got a Paul sort of version of Christianity, which you say is very different from what the Gospels project for you.
Mm-hmm.
The Gospels, I've had Jehovah's Witnesses say to me, "Oh, they find Paul a bit of a, bit difficult." The Gospels are, it's children's literature, isn't it? Anyone can understand a man perambulates about the world and perambulates about his back door, really, and he does a few simple tricks, like gives someone his sight. I mean, a real God could give everybody their sight, but no, he has to bump into somebody along the way and he gives him his sight. So that's what he does. But Paul, we don't hear about this person at all in Paul. It's a different sort of story, isn't it? It's a different story. We're talking about Lord Jesus Christ. Lord Jesus Christ, he's sort of up there in the sky. There's none of the practicalities of a person that Paul should have, been hanging on his coattails if he really existed. After all, Paul tells us he was, really into the law, really into Judaism, wasn't he? Scripture. He was, exceeded beyond all the others. He was in Judea at precisely the time that Jesus was supposedly knocking around. That's how the chronologies stack up. And yet he doesn't meet him. How? It's like Michael Jackson coming to your hometown, and you're really keen on Michael Jackson, but you happen to not go to his concert. Is that very likely? Jesus is supposedly calling all these crowds from all over Judea to see his miracles or what have you. And Paul is somehow out of town at the time. He misses them all, and yet. Paul carries the can for Christianity. And it's obviously what's really happening here is, a rethink halfway through the story's development. And they have to now bring in Paul. And Paul is actually making a much more practical contribution, because he's supposedly founding churches. He's supposedly writing out the theology of it all, and he doesn't have to hang around with a guy like a groupie for a year or two. He just gets messages straight from heaven, doesn't he? And he writes it all down. He's inspired by all this. Well, it's obviously a nonsense. It's obviously a composite story that's barely put together in a coherent way. When you read the Acts of the Apostles, which is an attempt to do that, you realize how badly it all fits together, in terms of being a consistent, unbelievable story, because it isn't. Unless you have faith, it isn't a believable story. It just doesn't convince anybody.
And sticking to the subject on Paul for a bit, and to point 8, yeah. Paul in Galatians, and it makes a statement that's fascinating to me. That he states that Jesus had chosen him before he was even born. And when I think about that, it's like, okay. What I've thought about to myself before is that if you kind of put that with 2 Corinthians, because my take on 2 Corinthians, when Paul supposedly flees from Damascus, from King Aretas IV, and the strange thing about King Aretas IV is, and many scholars have noticed this, is like, wait a minute, King Aretas IV never controlled Damascus. And the Romans, since the 60s BCE, controlled Damascus. So the Nabateans never controlled Damascus in the 1st century CE. And that was problematic. And then in 2 Corinthians, Paul states that he doesn't lower himself, he is lowered on a basket. And then he runs from King Aretas, a guy that never controlled Damascus. And I couldn't help but think to myself, that sounds just a little like Moses' nativity. He's put on a basket, he's floating on a river to run away from Pharaoh. Well, he obviously, the baby can't run himself, so he needs help. And it kind of sounds like Paul. I thought about it being, could it be Paul exaggerating how he was born? And if that's true, then it could be argued that Paul wasn't even directly a contemporary of Jesus. He was born shortly after the man was allegedly crucified, which could dovetail with Galatians saying, with him saying in Galatians that the celestial Jesus chose him. Before he was even born.
It doesn't sit happily in anyone's mind if they're thinking rationally.
Right.
I mean, I've looked at Paul quite a bit, and certainly is supposed fun and games in Damascus doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, let's start off with the fact, 1 minute he's a young man who holds the coats of the people that are stoning Stephen, right? Yeah. I don't know how. They don't say how old he is, but Stephen's, the first martyr, right? It's not long after the crucifixion there. And Paul is holding coats. But the next time, he's the chief persecutor of the Christians, yeah? The high priest has selected him to be the chief persecutor of the Christians. You think, well, he's got quite a quick promotion there, from coat coat girl to chief prosecutor, and it's not underestimated. It was night and day, pulling them out of their houses, and some of them were apparently killed. Although their martyrdom soon gets forgotten because it's not them who feature in the story. But okay, so then Paul gets this commission to go up to Damascus. You think, and the chief priest has got the authority to do that in another Roman province. He's going to send him to go up there and rescue these people. And then you think, well, hang on, because the amazing little thing at the end of the bit in the gospel about that is that the Christians fled to Damascus, but except the apostles, right? They are still in Jerusalem. So you think, so he's going after some minor recruits who've run away, and yet the main guys are still in the city, and he ignores them. Now, that is one strange sort of persecution, isn't it? And the other thing about that persecution is when Paul converted, is taken by Christians to Tarsus to get him out of the way. They fear the Jews, of course, but the persecution stops. So you think, what was this? A one-man persecution? I mean, is that even possible? Is that even possible? You know, but you have to have the stupidity induced by Christianity to roll through these verses and not notice these silly bits and pieces that make up the story. And that's of course, how Acts of the Apostles puts it. This terrible clobbering together of nonsense. And yet, well, no wonder the church for centuries forbade ordinary people from reading the Bible. They couldn't access it. It was something that the priest dispensed to them when the priest could read the Bible. Of course, in the end, even the priests couldn't read the Bible. They were so illiterate. But, it's like the triumph of simply a mashed up mythology, but really the reality was a criminal organization called Holy Mother Church. That was the reality, that Holy Mother Church took over Europe and imposed itself and created these sort of fiefdoms of Christianity, where they just enriched themselves and built themselves monstrous buildings to intimidate ordinary folk, who then slaved away to keep them in that way. And it's from that we're retreating out of now, slowly but surely. And the priests still hang on to what they can. They still hang on to their nonsense stories. They still hang on to their scams, which get revealed again and again and again. It would almost make one weep. That's why I laugh at it all, because it is laughable, because otherwise you'd cry about it all, because it's such a tragedy.
So I think the conclusion to point 8 is Paul, a suspicious individual, persecutes the church, suddenly changes sides conveniently. And Jesus, a guy he never meets, and it can't even be quite firmly established if he's actually a contemporary or a near contemporary of the man, only meets him through visions, and never meets the earthly, physical Jesus. And suspicious statements like, he's born of a woman. Doesn't name his mother, but he's born of a woman. And as he said that in Galatians and Philippians, he says, he became a man. Without naming the father.
I saw a quip the other day. It's very old quip, but it said, if you believe the Bible, you become a Christian. But if you believe the Bible, you become a Christian. If you read the Bible, you become an atheist, because it is so stupid. It's so stupid, and it's no wonder it's often dressed up as children's stories. It's no wonder it's acted out. People can act out this little pageant of baby Jesus. I can still remember when I had my turn at being in a nativity play, and I got to be one of the shepherds, and I mean, the church, coined the phrase, give me a child until he's 7, and I'll give you the man. You get young minds, and there's something terrible that happens because young children are programmed at an early age to believe what their parents and figures in authority tell them.
Mm.
They don't question those things. Mum says, "Don't touch the fire." You don't touch the fire. You don't explore it. And unfortunately, young brains absorb that nonsense, and so the churches, all churches, not just for Christianity, all churches want to get in and poison the mind of children. Poison the mind of children, and then it's going to take them years to escape it. And I know because I hear people write to me, they tell me they've spent 10, 20, 30 years in the church and have taken so long to escape it and realize what nonsense it was and how much they've suffered and their sacrifice for believing that nonsense. And, I have to say, America is the headquarters of Christ Incorporated. I mean, you're largely escaping this, but your corporations for Christ are still spreading their tentacles around the world.
So let's go to point 9. I want to revisit something that we talked about earlier, and that's the parallels. But instead of looking at different religions and their parallels to Jesus, let's focus more on like the things Josephus says that seems like the Gospels are amalgamating and applying to Jesus' character. Instances like, okay, Jesus has been announced. We talked about him earlier. His apocalyptic preaching sounds a lot like Jesus' preaching the coming apocalypse in Mark 13, the Olivet Discourse. And from whence the other Gospels get their versions of the Olivet Discourse from. But Josephus himself, I think this is in his life, his Vita. He mentions, it's either his life or probably Jewish Wars, but I know he wrote this. I think this is even noted on your website, because I know on your website you leave a significant list of parallels, which I'll be having this going through the screen right now, for people to take a look at this, and the links will be in the description too. Josephus is in a cave for 3 days. And at one point, on the 3rd day, some women go into the cave. When they find Josephus in there, they're weeping too. Something like that. And when I read that, I'm like, that's so strange. Did somebody take an instance in Josephus' life and kind of exaggerated it and applied it to Jesus? And on top of Jesus being Ananias, and then there's another Jesus in Josephus. And all of this on the screen too. Jesus, son of Saphias, this guy that's fighting Commander Vespasian and Tiberius, and he flees him teriyaki, as you were mentioning earlier, teriyaki. And this Jesus is the leader of 600 fishermen. And the battle goes horribly for Jesus, and he flees. Although he later appears to be caught and killed, at least Josephus implies it when Vespasian captures Tiberius. He says the seditious ringleaders of Tiberius, the seditious ringleaders are put down. So it would appear that Jesus was eventually caught. But when I look at that, it reminds me, as I'm sure it has reminded you, you did point these parallels out on your website, but that sounds like Jesus, the fisher of men. Says, I am the fisher of men. And he tells his followers, you will become fishers of men. And I know that Joseph Atwell noted that Vespasian sending troops down to the sea, or the Lake of Galilee, whatever, to spear the Jews that are down there. And this is after the battle with this Jesus character goes terrible for him. And Vespasian wins. So would you say that these are instances of amalgamations on top of the amalgamations taken from mythology, from Orion and Poseidon, Dionysus, from these gods and these characters that Josephus is talking about, Josephus' own life? Would you say that these characteristics are being applied to Jesus?
I think there's an important point about that, where we put Josephus, his histories, and the Jesus story, right? We know that Josephus was a general for the Jews, but then he went over to the side of the Romans because he could see defeat was going to happen, and he saved his own skin. You know, I mean, anyone might have done the same, right? He wasn't, you know, wasn't stupid in that sense. And Vespasian took him into his entourage because he heard about the prophecy, and Vespasian had his eye on what was happening in Rome. So yeah, so we know Josephus was taken to Rome, set up in Rome by Vespasian, and set about writing his histories, and it glorified, you know, the Vespasian and the Flavian, sure. And so, but it wasn't, you know, dispassionate. It did point out useful things that all historians find valuable. And it's a massive book, you know. It certainly his book is very comprehensive. The interesting thing is we have it. We have it. Now, one thing about that is we have it because the Christians copied it. Yeah. Now you think, well, yeah, but they didn't just copy anything, did they? They just didn't copy everything that they could have copied. And if there was something that wasn't terribly favourable to them, they didn't copy it. But Josephus, they managed to massage to get it into their storybook, right? In the sense that he was affectionately known to the early Christians as our Josephus, you know, because he seemed to give a backstory to the Jesus tale. Because obviously, the religion began with children and superstitious women. You know, silly, uneducated people acquired this fascination for living forever by believing in Jesus. So that's where the religion, you know, cut its teeth. But then, of course, it starts to percolate up the social structure. And so it comes to the attention of more intelligent people who are asked a bit more questions about it. And Josephus was a source of verification for the Christians, but only once they rewrote their gospel to fit. So it was primarily Luke who came along and who wrote his extended gospel with its book of Acts, you know, to somehow bring the fable from the first century into the second century. And he used Josephus as a source book for tidbits of useful information, and that has been traced repeatedly by different researchers. You know, you can see how it's been done. Now, I used to do some stuff with Joe Atwell when he got going with his Caesar's Messiah stuff, but I could never go as far as Joe as saying, well, then the Romans invented Christianity. You know, I do not think that at all, right? I really don't think they even knew what Christianity was at that point in history. You know, it just was, you know, a few fringe people with the same beliefs that they didn't even agree with each other. You know, so I don't think it was a viable proposition. I mean, even at the time of Constantine, remember, only 5% of the Roman Empire was Christian. 95% of them were not. You know, that's after 3 centuries. That's how little traction it ever made until that time. The Christians are always exaggerating the impact of their heroes in the past. You know, Paul, for example, you go back to Paul, you would almost believe that when Paul went into Ephesus, it was the big news, wouldn't you? The big story of the day. Paul, this Jewish guy, has come into town, you know, a city of 250,000 people. Their theatres, their temples, their marketplaces. What do you think they would have thought of some Jewish holy man getting off a boat and saying you're all wrong? I mean, you know, the idea that he overturned the city of, you know, but that's what Christians do all the time. Their heroes are given, you know, these wonderful roles in the past that nobody can verify because it's all bogus, it's all untrue, and you know, so yeah, there is an important point there about Josephus, very valuable, preserved because the Christians, for them, it proved useful. And they only had to do two things, didn't they? They altered a couple of paragraphs where the best places they could put in a reference to Jesus so that they could ever after say, there you are, there's someone who verifies there was a Jesus. You know, they've used that for centuries. And it silenced most people, because how could anyone contradict it? But we know better now. We know better. You know, we know, so the latest thing on that. Yeah, I know you've talked about the testimonium so many times, but this current thing is about partial interpolation. Have you ever heard of such crap? The idea is you've got a statement. Well, it's bogus. Well, if we rub out the bits that you think to make it bogus, but I know it's genuine, right? I mean, what lunacy? What lunacy is that? But it is what it is. It doesn't say much, even in the bits where it says it. One golden paragraph that says it. Oh yeah, it's all true what the Christians are saying. Now back to talking about the aqueduct. I mean, it's.
What's interesting about that is that Origen, he's a church father writing in the early 1st century, is somewhat upset with Josephus, because he says that Josephus does not believe that Jesus was the Christ, and his copy of Josephus, from what his copy of Josephus says that it was the death of James that caused the war. And this kind of gets into the Brandon Eisenman hypothesis, the zealot hypothesis, which has intrigued me, because if there was a guy, he probably would have been a zealot, because him being crucified, it would make much sense if he wasn't seditious. That, of course, assumes he existed in some way, and some would argue that, because there's one person I know that argues that the Jesus Christ mentioned by Josephus is so vague. The two parallels between this character and the New Testament character is they both have a similar name and they're both crucified. That's it. So one could argue that, okay, this character Josephus is talking about is just coincidentally similar to the Jesus in the New Testament, but it's not the same character, and that Eusebius modified it in the early 4th century CE to make it look a little more like the New Testament Jesus.
Yeah.
I'm just throwing that in there. Yeah.
When we come as far as Eusebius, we really are into wholesale fabrication. I mean, he wrote the original history of the church, and he gave us some early references, but it's interesting what he doesn't say as much as what he does say. And there's things he doesn't know. I found it interesting that he doesn't know about Nero burning Christians.
Right.
He doesn't know about that. Now, isn't that interesting? Eusebius in the 4th century doesn't know about Nero burning Christians, because, of course, Nero didn't burn Christians. There's another part of this glorious fable. There's no evidence of early Christians in Rome at all. There isn't.
I think that sums up point 9, and point 10 can be quickly done. We can be done with point 10 pretty quickly, because really this kind of gets into point 10. Christian forgeries and anachronism involving Eusebius, because one of the forgeries Eusebius wrote is the Doctrine of Adi. Some will argue the Doctrine of Adi was forged a little earlier, but I think my personal opinion at the moment is that Eusebius did it, because it doesn't show up before Eusebius, the Doctrine of Adi, and it makes this very funny statement, and I giggle every time I read this. He states that in the time of Jesus, the governor of Judea, just after Pilate, was Albinus. But actually, he says that that's the governor of Syria, so he actually gets the location wrong and the time wrong, because the translator of the Doctrine of Adi noted that, that's Governor Albinus and Josephus. And the problem with that is he ruled 25 years after Tiberius died. So how could it be? Because Eusebius says he's writing to Tiberius. So how is Tiberius receiving letters from Albinus when Tiberius is dead? And Albinus becomes governor 25 years later. So he's writing to a dead man. And and the thing is, you go back to Josephus for a moment.
Yeah.
Josephus tells us about a Jesus Beninatus again. The Jews got mad at him. This happened on 63 CE. And they're tired of him saying, "Oh, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed at some point in the future." So they capture him, and they bring him before Governor Albinus. And then Albinus says, "Okay, he's just a lunatic. Let him go." Which could remind one of Barabbas and him getting released by Pilate. But at the same time, I can't help but think Eusebius read that, and that's where he got the idea of hurling Governor Albinus into the Jesus story, anachronistically speaking.
Yeah. The big problem for mythicists is the sheer quantity of material that we have to deal with, because the lie can be kept quite simple. You can have your big evangelical church, and thousands of people are happy to sing happy clappy hymns and sort of feel the power of Jesus all around them, and it's such an anti-intellectual approach. And you try and speak to such people and you're wasting your time. They just don't want to know the nitty-gritty of who wrote what when is the chronology all over the show and the rest of it. Mm-hmm. So someone has got to have doubts in their mind to begin with. That's how I feel about it. Occasionally I've been invited to churches and have spoken to audiences, and they're very polite. Mm-hmm. They sit there smiling, and I can tell them that the most colossal errors in the story, and they just will smile and say, "Yeah, but I know Jesus talks to me," and. And what do you do?
That's the problem, that many religions will claim that their personal God talks to them, and with this thing, like, okay, and their methodology is, well, if you feel that God talking to you, there you go, that's your proof. And then those same people will say, actually, those people think they're talking to their God, but they're talking to Satan. But they can't. So how do you distinguish it? First off, we can't even get past step one, proving it's actually happening.
Yeah.
To begin with.
Yeah, I see religion as a phase in humanity's evolution, which began in a very primitive time, and yes, it reached a certain level of sophistication, you could say, but now science is really defeating it. It's a long struggle. It's a long struggle because we Westerners can't say you'll live forever. There's no way we're going to say you're going to live forever. You're all going to die. I mean, that's the reality. But these people can't live with reality, can they?
No.
So okay, and we do what we can do.
Yeah.
Well, I think we got to our 10, and that's about an hour of chatting. So that's really good. That's really good.
Yeah, it is. I've got one more question I want to hurl in here before we end this. You talk about John Allegro and Jesus Never Existed, and his mushroom origins of Christianity. And I just wanted to ask, because I wanted to get your thoughts about this on video, is why I'm asking. Obviously, what do you think about that? What do you think about that? The mushroom hypothesis.
John Allegro got a bad rap, and unfortunately and unfortunately, it seemed to bring on his early death. But there is no doubt that hallucinogenic drugs have played a big role in all religions. They have. You know, people who feel the Lord often use either wittingly or unwittingly drugs of some fashion. You know, the classic one of the caves in parts of Greece and Turkey where the ancients would commune with the gods. And we now know it's sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, or whatever it is, some chemical substance leaking out. I've visited these places, they're still leaking out fumes and what have you. But now we know it makes you lightheaded if it doesn't put you out entirely. So yes, drugs could induce a form of hallucinations, and why not magic mushrooms, because they can have that effect. Yes, you go through a forest and eat all the mushrooms, if you don't die, you'll certainly have visions. I mean, yes. So to me, the story is quite plausible. Whether John Allegro, I remember he was working on the
Dead Sea Scrolls,
Dead Sea Scrolls at the time. He was doing lots of very important work, unscrambling these thousands of fragments, and it was becoming apparent to him, from that alone, that Christianity had its real origins were nothing like it claimed, and so yes. So he was tentatively looking for an alternative solution. So I think he should be resurrected at some stage, or redeemed from where he got placed. Yeah. I mean, have you been thinking about John Allegro's approach just lately yourself then? Because he doesn't get too much mention nowadays.
Yeah, I've looked into his work here and there. I know that Dead Sea Scroll scholars are very hostile to his work, primarily because, according to them, he has misrepresented the Dead Sea Scrolls in some way. He's gotten filled with a lot of errors. I've heard about a French paper, somebody writing a paper in French, 100 pages long, criticizing and listing a bunch of errors in his work. But there are other authors out there, including someone else I've interviewed on this channel, that believes that cannabis was involved in early Christianity heavily. And all I'll say is I can see where they're coming from.
Why wouldn't it be? They had plants. They didn't identify narcotic plants. They had plants, and they plants. Some they might use to sprinkle on their food, but others, why wouldn't they be using these drugs? I mean, from the sweat, the sweat tents of the Indians used to have, the lodges, the sweat lodges. People have used all kinds of ways to, escape the presence, isn't it? Escape into a different world. Okay, they didn't realize it was their mind playing tricks. They thought they were, wandering the cost of the earth or something. But so there is no question that drugs have played a part in Christianity. It has. It has.
Well, all right. I think we can stop there. I just want to say real quick that I want to thank you for joining me. This has been a great conversation.
I'm sorry it took so long. I mean,
Oh no, this happens. I understand. It happens. But again, thanks again for coming on. We should have this again at some point. This has been a fun conversation.
Yeah, of course.
Very fun.
Yeah. I was fond for 20 years of saying anytime, any place, I'll talk about Christians or Christians or anytime, Jesus. But to be honest, I've got a little bit weary of Jesus, and I try and do some other things nowadays. But he never leaves me. He's always there.
So I'm gonna remind the audience, check the links in the description. Oh, and I'm going to leave a link to Kenneth Humphreys' YouTube channel. He has a YouTube channel. I'll have it up here at the end screen of the video as well, so any of you can go click on that and it'll take you straight to his YouTube channel. Yeah, that's the book.
Just so they can see the book.
Yeah.
Thick book.
All right. Well, thanks again for joining me, Kenneth.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
You take care.
You too. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.